Every time you open your phone, a tiny blue dot tells you exactly where you are. It feels so normal that most of us never stop to think about it. But for almost all of human history, that blue dot didn't exist. There were no maps, no roads, no street names, and no signs pointing the way home. One wrong decision could leave you lost forever. Yet ancient humans somehow crossed forests, deserts, mountains, and even entire continents without getting hopelessly lost. So how did they do it? The answer begins with a map that was never drawn, and a navigation system every humanist still carries today. When we hear the word map, most of us picture a piece of paper or a screen filled with roads, rivers, and city names. But the very first maps looked nothing like that. In fact, they were never drawn at all. Long before humans learned to write, they were already traveling across huge distances. They followed rivers to find fresh water, returned to the same hunting grounds every season, and crossed unfamiliar landscapes without leaving a single trail behind. So how was that even possible? The answer begins with the most powerful navigation tool ancient humans ever had: their memory. Scientists believe the human brain evolved to remember places long before it evolved to read or write. Deep inside the brain is a region called the hippocampus. It plays a major role in forming memories and helping us understand where we are in relation to the world around us. Every time you remember the route to your home, your favorite restaurant, or where you parked your car, your hippocampus is quietly doing its job. Ancient humans relied on this ability every single day. Instead of remembering street names, they remembered landmarks: a river that curved like a snake, a cliff shaped like a giant face, a lonely tree standing in an open valley. These natural features became reference points that connected together like pieces of a giant mental puzzle. Researchers call this a cognitive map. It is an internal picture of the world built entirely inside the mind. You cannot hold it in your hands, but it allows you to move through familiar places with surprising accuracy. This ability was so important that it likely helped our ancestors survive. Getting lost was not just inconvenient. It could mean missing water, losing your group, or walking straight into the territory of dangerous predators. And ancient humans were incredibly good at it. Evidence suggests that modern humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, a journey that required crossing stretches of open sea. Later, humans spread into nearly every environment on Earth, from frozen Siberia to remote Pacific islands. None of those journeys would have been possible without an extraordinary sense of direction. But remembering a landscape yourself is one thing. Passing that knowledge to your children and then to hundreds of people who had never walked those paths before was an entirely different challenge. And that forced ancient humans to invent something even more remarkable than a map. They turned the landscape into stories that could be remembered for generations. A map inside one person's mind was incredibly useful, but it had one serious problem. What happened when that person died? If the only person who knew the way to a distant water source never came back from a hunt, that knowledge could disappear forever. For ancient humans, losing directions did not just mean getting lost. It could mean losing access to food, water, or safe shelter. So they found a remarkable solution. Instead of writing maps, they told them. Across the world, early societies passed knowledge from one generation to the next through stories, songs, and repeated journeys. A child did not simply learn that a river was north of the camp. They learned a story about the strange rock beside that river, the old tree that survived every storm, or the valley where animals gathered every spring. Every landmark became part of a story, making it much harder to forget. One of the most extraordinary examples comes from the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. For thousands of years, they used what researchers call song lines. These were not ordinary songs. Each one described a journey across the landscape, connecting water holes, mountains, rock formations, and sacred places in a precise order. By singing the verses correctly, a traveler could follow a route stretching hundreds of miles, even through places with no roads or signs. Imagine using music instead of a map. To many of us, that sounds impossible. Yet this system guided people across Australia for countless generations, long before paper maps ever existed. Modern scientists have discovered that stories and music help the brain remember information far better than random facts. That is one reason many people still remember the alphabet through a song they learned as children. Ancient humans were using the same principle thousands of years before anyone understood how memory worked. The land was no longer just something they walked across. It became something they could remember, teach, and pass on. But even the greatest memory had limits. Stories could tell you where to go, but they could not help if thick clouds covered the sky, a familiar landmark disappeared, or you entered a place you had never seen before. At that point, ancient humans had to rely on something even older than memory itself, something that had been guiding every journey from the very beginning. Stories worked well when the land stayed the same. A mountain did not move. A river usually followed the same path. A strange-looking rock could guide people for generations. But ancient humans often traveled far beyond familiar places. They crossed open grasslands where every direction looked the same. They walked through deserts with almost no landmarks. Some even sailed across stretches of open water where there was nothing to remember except the endless horizon. So how did they avoid getting completely lost? They looked up. Long before telescopes or astronomy, ancient humans noticed that the sky followed patterns. The sun always rose in roughly the east and set in the west. The stars returned to the same positions year after year. Certain constellations appeared only during particular seasons, quietly telling people when it was time to travel, hunt, or prepare for colder weather. The night sky became something much more than a beautiful view. It became a guide. Thousands of years later, sailors would use the same idea to cross entire oceans. But the habit of reading the sky almost certainly began much earlier, when survival depended on knowing which direction would lead back to water, shelter, or home. Nature offered clues almost everywhere. The flow of a river revealed where higher ground and lower valleys were. Moss often grew more thickly on the damper side of rocks and trees, although it was never reliable enough to use on its own. Seasonal winds followed familiar patterns in many regions. Animal trails often led toward water sources that humans could not yet see. Ancient humans did not depend on just one clue. They combined dozens of small clues at the same time. That was the real secret. They were constantly comparing the land, the sky, the weather, and their own memories, building a picture that became more accurate with every step. In many ways, they were doing what modern GPS systems do today, except the calculations were happening inside the human brain. But eventually, memory, stories, and nature were no longer enough. As human communities became larger and trade routes stretched farther than ever before, people needed a way to share directions with complete strangers, even those who had never seen the journey themselves. For the first time in history, humans faced a challenge that could not be solved by memory alone. That was the moment the world's first real maps began to appear. For thousands of years, memory was enough. Stories were enough. The stars were enough. So why did humans suddenly feel the need to draw a map? The answer was not because they were getting lost more often. It was because the world around them was becoming too complicated to keep inside one person's mind. As small hunting groups slowly grew into villages, and villages turned into busy settlements, people began traveling farther than ever before. They traded stone, shells, salt, and later metals with communities hundreds of miles away. Routes became longer. Destinations became more numerous. Remembering every path was no longer practical. For the first time, people needed a way to share places with someone who had never been there. That changed everything. One of the oldest discoveries often linked to mapping comes from Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey. Around 9,000 years ago, people painted a large wall image showing rows of houses with what may be a nearby volcano. Some archaeologists believe it is the world's oldest town map. Others argue it is simply a piece of artwork or a symbolic painting. That debate is still going on today. And that tells us something fascinating. The first maps were probably so different from modern maps that even experts sometimes cannot agree on what counts as a map. Another remarkable example comes from Babylon. Around 600 BC, Babylonian scribes carved maps onto clay tablets. Unlike earlier drawings, these maps were designed to organize rivers, cities, and surrounding regions. They were no longer just memories placed on a wall. They had become tools for planning, trade, and government. This is where a common myth begins. Many people imagine that maps were invented so travelers would not get lost. But the evidence tells a different story. Some of the earliest surviving maps were never meant for ordinary travelers at all. They helped rulers manage land, collect taxes, mark property, and control growing kingdoms. In many cases, a map was less about finding your way and more about deciding who owned what. That simple shift changed history. A map was no longer just a guide, it became a source of power. And once people realized they could draw the world, they also discovered something even more powerful. They could change the way other people saw it. Once humans began drawing maps, something unexpected happened. People slowly stopped depending on memory. Instead of carrying the landscape inside their minds, they could now carry a small piece of it in their hands. That sounds like progress, and it was. But it also created a new problem. A map can never show everything. Think about it. If you tried to draw every tree, every rock, every hill, and every stream, the map would become as large as the land itself. A useful map has to leave things out. Every map is a choice. It decides what is important and what can be ignored. A hunter might only care about rivers, animal trails, and safe places to camp. A merchant wants trade routes and towns. A king wants borders, roads, and valuable land. The same landscape can produce completely different maps depending on who is drawing it. That is why historians often say maps tell us just as much about people as they do about places. One of the most famous examples comes from the Roman Empire. The Romans built thousands of miles of roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But many Roman maps were not designed to show the true shape of the land. They were designed to show how every road connected back to Rome. The message was clear. No matter where you traveled, Rome was the center of the world. Centuries later, European explorers created maps that placed their own continents in the middle. Other civilizations did exactly the same thing. Again and again, people drew the world from their own point of view. Maps were no longer just helping people find places. They were quietly shaping how people understood the world itself. And that raises a surprising question. If every map leaves something out, and every map reflects the person who made it, is there such a thing as a completely accurate map? The answer forced scientists to confront a problem that still exists today. Even in the age of satellites and GPS, today it feels like maps have finally become perfect. Open your phone and within seconds you can see streets, buildings, rivers, and even your exact location. It seems impossible for a modern map to be wrong, but every map you have ever seen, including the one on your phone, leaves something out. That is not a mistake. It is unavoidable. The Earth is a three-dimensional sphere, but a map is flat. The moment you try to flatten a round planet onto a piece of paper or a screen, something has to change. Distances stretch. Shapes become distorted. Sizes are no longer completely accurate. There is simply no way around it. One of the best-known examples is the Mercator projection, first introduced by the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator in 1569. It became incredibly popular because it helped sailors navigate long ocean voyages using straight compass directions. But it came with a hidden trade-off. Countries closer to the North and South poles appear much larger than they really are. Greenland looks almost as large as Africa, even though Africa is actually about 14 times bigger. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. And that is just one example. Digital maps face the same problem in a different way. They constantly decide which roads deserve labels, which buildings should appear first, and which details disappear as you zoom in or out. Every map filters reality so your brain can understand it without becoming overwhelmed. In a way, that is exactly what ancient humans were doing thousands of years ago. Their minds ignored countless details and remembered only the information that mattered for survival. The technology has changed, the principle has not, which leads to one final mystery. If maps have never been completely accurate, and if humans were navigating the world long before maps existed, then what has always been the greatest navigation tool of all? Surprisingly, the answer is not something we invented. It is something we were born with. For thousands of years, humans searched for better ways to understand the world. They carved maps into stone, they painted them on walls, they pressed them into clay, later they drew them on paper. Today, we keep them inside our phones. But after all that progress, scientists made a surprising discovery. The most powerful navigation system humans have ever used was never something we invented. It was something we evolved. One of the most famous studies came from neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire at University College London. Her team studied London's black cab drivers, people who spend years memorizing nearly every street in one of the world's most confusing cities. Brain scans revealed something remarkable. The part of the brain responsible for navigation and spatial memory, called the hippocampus, was noticeably more developed in experienced taxi drivers than in many other people. In other words, the more they navigated, the more their brains adapted. This was not just about remembering street names. Their brains were constantly building, updating, and refining an internal map of the city. Sound familiar? It should. Thousands of years before the first paper map existed, ancient humans were doing the very same thing. Every journey, every hunting trip, every river crossing, and every mountain pass added another piece to an invisible map stored inside their minds. The tools changed. The human brain did not, even today. If your phone suddenly loses its signal, you do not instantly become helpless. You still recognize familiar buildings, remember important turns, notice the position of the sun, and connect one landmark to the next. Without realizing it, your brain quietly takes over, just as it did for our ancestors thousands of years ago. Which means the invention of maps was never really about replacing human memory, it was about expanding it. And that changes the entire story. Ancient humans did not begin their journey by drawing maps. They drew maps because they had already spent countless generations carrying the world inside their minds. That simple idea completely changes the way we think about one of humanity's greatest inventions, and it leaves us with one final realization. By now, it might seem like maps were one of humanity's greatest inventions. And in many ways, they were. But here's something most people never think about. What if humans were not the first creatures to navigate using maps? Scientists have discovered that many animals also build mental maps of the world around them. Food-storing birds, such as Clark's nutcrackers, can hide tens of thousands of seeds across huge areas and return months later to many of the exact same hiding places. They are not following a scent trail. They are using memory. Honeybees do something even more surprising. When a bee finds a rich source of flowers, it returns to the hive and performs what scientists call the waggle dance. By changing the direction and length of its movements, the bee tells other bees where to fly, how far the flowers are, and even their position relative to the sun. In a way, it is sharing a map without ever drawing one. Researchers have also found that elephants remember the locations of water holes they have not visited for years. During long droughts, older females often lead entire herds back to these hidden water sources, using memories built over decades. So the ability to create an internal map did not begin with humans. Nature had been using the same idea for millions of years. What made humans different was something else. We could take the map inside one brain and place it inside another. At first, we did it with stories. Then with songs, later with drawings carved into stone and pressed into clay. Eventually, we printed maps on paper. Today, we store them on satellites and phones that fit inside our pockets. The technology changed again and again. The goal never did. Every generation found a better way to pass knowledge farther than a single lifetime. And maybe that is the real invention. Not the map itself, but the ability to share it, because a map locked inside one mind can only guide one person. A map shared with others can guide an entire civilization. Which brings us to one final question. If humans have spent thousands of years making better and better maps, what does that say about the way we see the world today? And could the maps we rely on every day still be changing the way we think without us even noticing? By now, it might seem like this story ends with paper maps, but it doesn't, because the greatest map humans ever invented was never a piece of paper. It was the ability to share knowledge across generations. Think about everything we have discovered so far. The first maps lived inside the human brain, then they became stories that parents told their children. Those stories turned into songs that guided people across entire landscapes. Later, they were carved into stone, painted onto walls, and pressed into clay. Each step solved the same problem. How do you pass your understanding of the world to someone who has never seen it before? That simple question changed human history. A child no longer had to spend years exploring every river or mountain alone. They could begin where the previous generation had finished. Every journey added new knowledge, and every new discovery became part of humanity's growing map of the world. This is one of the biggest reasons humans spread across nearly every corner of the planet. Knowledge no longer disappeared when one person died. It could outlive them. Over thousands of years, these shared maps connected distant communities through trade, helped explorers reach unfamiliar lands, and allowed civilizations to grow far beyond what any single person could have imagined. In a way, every map ever created is a conversation between generations. Someone explored the land, someone remembered it, someone shared it, and someone else used that knowledge to go even farther. That chain has never been broken. Today, satellites orbit thousands of miles above Earth, constantly updating digital maps that millions of people use every day. It feels like an incredible leap from the first humans who navigated with stories and stars. But the idea behind both is exactly the same. One generation is leaving directions for the next, and perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this entire story. Ancient humans did not invent maps because they were smarter than everyone before them. They invented maps because they understood something that still shapes our lives today. No one can explore the whole world alone, but together each generation can leave the next one a better map than the one it inherited. The next time you open a map on your phone, it is easy to forget just how extraordinary that moment really is. Behind that simple blue dot is a journey that began tens of thousands of years ago. Long before paper, long before compasses, and long before satellites, ancient humans were already mapping the world. First with their memories, then with stories, then with the stars, and finally with drawings that allowed one generation to pass its knowledge to the next. The invention of maps was never really about finding places. It was about making sure that no one had to start from the beginning again. Every map ever created, from a rough sketch scratched into stone to the GPS in your pocket, is part of the same human story. A story of curiosity, survival, and our endless desire to understand the world just a little better than the people who came before us. In the end, ancient humans did not simply invent maps. They invented a way to share the world. And we are still following the paths they left behind. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, make sure to subscribe because there are many more ancient human mysteries waiting to be uncovered.